In this video, we'll be talking about the early Mexican Republic. Last time we were talking about the wars for independence in Mexico, and we talked about the establishment of the first Mexican Empire with its emperor, Augustine I, who ended up having to abdicate the throne, and he went into exile into Europe. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. And so with the end of the first Mexican Empire, we are going to have the first Mexican Republic. Now, with the First Mexican Republic, you're going to have a lot of political turmoil, and part of that political turmoil is caused by two factions who had different ideas about how the Mexican government should be constructed. You have your Federalists and Centralists. And so these are two opposing sides with different views on how the Mexican government should be constructed. Well, we'll talk first about Federalists. Now, Federalists tended to be liberals, okay, meaning that they were open to rapid change. For a long time, for 300 years, Mexico had been a colony of the Spanish Empire. And so for that whole time, the colony was ruled by a king, right? That was the style of government. So now you're in a period of rapid change where you have the first republic in Mexico being created, right? And so what's the government going to look like? Is it going to be a federalist type of government where you have the divisions of power being broken up into several branches like you have in the United States? Or is it going to be more of a centralist type of government where you have a powerful central government and the states don't have quite as much power? That's the general difference between federalism and centralism, okay? So federalists, they are pushing for rapid change, right? They don't want a type of government that's anything like a monarchy. They're moving far away from colonial rule, and so they want to have a government, a federalist government, where the states have their own sovereignty. Okay, so there'll be a number of states in Mexico, just like you have states in the United States, and each state will have sovereignty, meaning that it will have its own state legislature, which creates its own laws that will govern that particular state. It's not the central government that will be creating laws for that state. The state's creating its own laws, right? Its own representatives are sitting on that state legislature and creating their own laws to govern themselves with their own interests in mind, right? With the interests of that state in mind when they're creating laws. Whereas if the central government were creating laws for all of the states, they may not have the particular interests of those states in mind, of the inhabitants of those states, right? They may just have the interests of the central government in mind, which may be different interests, right? So if you want to have more control over your local government, you want your state to have sovereignty, right? To be able to govern itself, to create its own laws with its own representatives. Okay, and so that's important for federalists, right? That states have their own sovereignty. They view centralism similar to despotism. And when I say despotism, I'm talking about monarchy. Okay, absolute monarchy. So basically what Mexico was experiencing under colonial rule from the Spanish Empire. That's despotism, where you have an absolute king, a monarch who is creating all the laws, and the local people don't have any say-so in the laws that are being created for them, that they have to live by. Okay, that's despotism. And so basically there's a lack of rights with despotism, and that's the issue that Federalists are concerned with. They don't want their individual rights to be taken away by the central government, and so that's why Federalists are against centralism, because if you have this powerful central government and the states don't have sovereignty, then maybe the individual rights of everyday citizens will get trampled upon by the central government. And that would be similar to despotism, or similar to what Mexico was experiencing under Spanish rule. So instead of having a king, like you did under colonial rule of Spain, now you have the central government. Same thing, right? Where individuals' rights are not being heard, and individuals don't have much of a say-so over their local government because the states don't have sovereignty. And so this is why Federalists were against centralism, right? This idea of having the strong central government. All right, so that's their perspective. That's the perspective of the Federalists. Now, on the other hand, you have a number of individuals, such as representatives of the church and wealthy conservative Creoles, who supported centralism. So yes, they tended to be more conservative in their views. They didn't necessarily want a king. I mean, they were okay with having a federal government, but they wanted that federal government to be much more powerful than the Federalists did. Okay, so for example, Centralists did not want the states to have sovereignty. Okay, and later on, when the Centralists do take control, you will see that the sovereignty of the states will be hindered, right, by the central government. Right? So no sovereignty for the states, or a very much more limited sovereignty for the states from the centralist perspective. Okay, and so there's a reason for this, right? Yes, they're conservative. Yes, they don't want to drift too far from the centralized style of rule that they experienced during colonial times, right? They don't want that rapid change, like switching to a federal style government, because that would be completely different from what was experienced during colonial times, right? They are conservatives. They want to keep things kind of similar to how they were, even though they're okay with change. They want it to be a much more slower, gradual change, right? They think that that's important because they believe that if you have sovereignty for the states, if the states have sovereignty, then each state has its own regional interests. And they believe that since the states all have their own interest for that particular region, then that means that the states may be divided and you may not have a unified Mexico. And remember, Mexico doesn't have a lot of experience with self-rule because of the style of colonialism that the Spanish Empire used there in Mexico, right? So there's not a lot of experience with self-rule, and so it's a new thing for a lot of Mexican politicians and the Mexican people. And so centralists were afraid, or at least this was their argument, they were afraid that if the states had sovereignty, that it would just cause chaos because you would have states going against states and no one would be able to agree on anything because everyone has their own regional interests, right? Things that are important to that particular region. And so that would cause division, right? And so that's why they want to have a strong central government and deny sovereignty for the states, at least during this early period, because this was a time where Mexico needed to be unified, not divided by regional interests. You see, so this is the argument of the centralists. They're basically saying, look, Mexico is barely learning how to govern itself after colonialism. We need to be unified, and we can't have the regional interests of various states causing divisions during this period of time. Okay, it's most important for us to be unified. Otherwise, if we're not unified, maybe another power like Spain or an imperial power may come in and be able to conquer us because we're politically unstable. Okay, so we need unity right now. So this is the argument of the centralists. Okay, now in reality, the divisions between these two groups, right, the Federalists and the Centralists, is causing political instability, and we'll definitely take a look at some specific examples of that as we move along. But for now, I just want you to be familiar with the basic ideas of federalism and centralism and the arguments that both sides gave to support their perspective on how the Mexican government should be constructed, right, during the early republic.